December 9th, 2025, the Tiger Plays team put together a list ranking the 16 deadliest creatures in Jurassic World alive. Fast forward all the way to May 12th, 2026, and YouTuber IDGT 902 decided to weigh in on the current state of the meta, assembling his own list of what he believes to be the strongest creatures in the game. After some thorough analysis, however, we noticed a few inconsistencies, to put it best. And after a bit of persuasion courtesy of the community, it looks like it's our turn to revisit what the true titans of Jurassic World alive currently are. For this ranking, this list will take into account every recently buffed and newly introduced creature currently impacting or projected to impact the meta moving forward. Furthermore, Tier 5s will not be taken into account for the main rankings. So without further ado, let us revisit Jurassic's deadliest creatures. Class is now in session. Starting off our list at number 16 is Fukuitops. Following its recent rebalance changes, the hybrid finds itself in a much healthier position within the meta. And unlike previous situations where creatures were completely gutted, this is an example of an actual nerf done properly. By extending the cooldown of group ripping impact, lowering the damage output, and reducing its ability to constantly cycle healing, the creature now has far more punish windows than before. Make no mistake, it is still a deadly opponent. Its infamous Cheater's Instinct setup remains intact, meaning the hybrid can still generate absurd swing turns through revenge kills and instinct combos if left unchecked. Interestingly enough, Shielded Heavy Strike now becomes far more important to the kit than before, since the hybrid can no longer endlessly rotate its strongest tools, forcing shield mind games installing the cooldowns to become a legitimate strategy for both players involved. Another factor contributing to the drop is the increased prevalence of daze across the current environment. Effects like these severely limit Fukuitops' pressure output, while simultaneously making revenge killing the hybrid far easier than before. Despite all this, however, Fukuitops still remains one of the stronger threats in the game, but unlike its previous incarnation, it now feels manageable instead of oppressive. Taking the number 15 spot is Rajadorixis, a hybrid that has quietly climbed its way back into relevance thanks to the recent additions to the meta. And interestingly enough, this resurgence didn't come from direct buffs, rather it simply benefited from the environment evolving around it. New creatures like Baryotor and Megatyrannus entering the scene gave the hybrid more opportunities to do what it's always done best: consistently apply pressure while acting as one of the game's most reliable bruisers. The ongoing war it has between the Beckle brothers also plays heavily into its favor, as Rajadorixis is still more than capable of entering those matchups and holding its own against both hybrids. Furthermore, with the recent buffs to Proto Lux, Rajadorixis actually gains more value thanks to its ability to deal substantial chip damage while stalling out key turns, combined with the recent nerfs to Fukuitops, and now it finds itself in a much more comfortable position overall. And truthfully, that's where this hybrid shines most. It may not be the flashiest creature in the current environment, but when it comes to consistency and reliability, Rajadorixis remains one of the safest picks you can bring into battle. Claiming the number 14th position is Monkeyondactylus, a hybrid that has quietly become far more threatening as the current environment continues shifting away from reliable flock control. Put simply, a large portion of the modern meta just isn't equipped to consistently deal with flocks anymore, and Monkeyondactylus takes full advantage of that. Steel Vigor remains the primary reason this creature succeeds, with the affliction over time being absolutely crucial to its viability. Without it, there's a very real chance this hybrid would fall several placements lower. Pair that with fantastic turn cycling, excellent synergy between its abilities, and strong swap-in value, and Monkeyondactylus becomes incredibly difficult to deal with over the course of a match. Combined with strong utility, oppressive sustain, and a meta environment that no longer punishes flocks as consistently as before, Monkeyondactylus comfortably secures its spot among the strongest hybrids in the game today. Taking the number 13 spot is Titanotholus, a hybrid whose recent nerf didn't necessarily kill the creature, but instead forced it in an entirely different niche. Previously, the Titan was capable of maintaining pressure far beyond turn 3, constantly snowballing momentum throughout a match. Now, however, the hybrid has become far more specialized, shifting heavily into a more trap-killing role. Protective Stomp into Thagomizer Whip still remains one of the most dangerous combinations in the game, and in many situations, attempting to swap into that setup is practically impossible. Ironically enough, the changes arguably made the creature even more punishing to swap against, while simultaneously forcing even more direct head-to-head engagements. That said, the nerf did come with some meaningful drawbacks. Titanotholus can no longer comfortably swap into threats like Becklerizsaurus, and once its initial momentum fades, the hybrid becomes noticeably easier to pressure compared to its previous incarnation. Even so, its ability to punish swap mistakes and secure revenge kills still makes Titanotholus one of the deadliest creatures in the current environment. Claiming the next spot is Junior, a creature that has remained remarkably consistent despite the constant shifts within the current meta. Its ability to safely disengage, repeatedly generate chip damage, and constantly threaten offensive utility makes the creature incredibly frustrating to deal with over the course of a match. And against major threats like Becklerizz, that versatility becomes especially valuable. What truly keeps Junior relevant, however, is how naturally the kit flows together. Nearly every interaction the creature has generates some form of value, whether it's maintaining momentum, stripping key effects, or punishing opponents for overcommitting. While the tiny tyrant itself hasn't changed much recently, the consistency and flexibility it brings into battle continue to make it one of the most safest and dependable creatures in the current environment. Entering this list of hybrid monstrosities at number 11 is one of the newest additions to the game, Megatyrannus. And while opinions surrounding this hybrid are still heavily divided, we here at the team genuinely believe people are underestimating just how dangerous this creature can become. The key distinction here is pretty simple. Megatyrannus is not a head-to-head specialist like Baryotor. Instead, this hybrid takes advantage of revenge killing windows to leverage the most optimal gameplay. In many ways, Megatyrannus almost feels like what would happen if Magnoraptor and Titanotholus had a child, combining extremely high damage output with terrifying revenge killing potential. The recent nerfs to Spinatops and Fukuitops also significantly increased the hybrid's value, giving it more breathing room within the current environment to capitalize on its strengths. Furthermore, the synergy between Untouchable Devouring Rampage and Shielded Recovery can become absolutely absurd over the course of a match, allowing the creature to sustain itself far longer than opponents may initially expect. And if we're talking tier 5 variants, let's just say this thing starts looking like Rajadorixis after consuming every single drug. That said, we will admit that this placement comes with a slight disclaimer. Megatyrannus is still relatively new, meaning perceptions and matchups could absolutely shift as the meta continues evolving. Stat-wise, there's definitely an argument that the creature could have been pushed a bit further, especially considering how difficult it is to obtain. But even so, we definitely see the vision here. Put this thing's speed over the 140s and it quickly becomes one of the deadliest revenge killers currently roaming the arena. Breaking into the top 10 is Mastodonsaurus, a creature that, despite not changing much recently, continues to prove why it remains one of the most reliable picks in the entire game. Truthfully, Mastodonsaurus does suffer from its rarity being decently difficult to snag at team level. However, it sure carries the old reliable syndrome as Rajadorixis, as it constantly finds ways to remain relevant regardless of how the meta shifts around it. And a huge part of that does come down to its absurd stat profile for an Omega. 50% base armor alone is already ridiculous, but pair that with excellent bulk, strong output, and the ability to consistently trade into many of the game's strongest threats, and you end up with a creature that constantly manages to generate value. Whether it's dealing with oppressive hybrids or simply outlasting opponents through sheer durability, Mastodonsaurus continues to excel at one thing above all else: consistency. Just a reliable powerhouse, doing what a powerhouse does best. For this reason, this creature will take the 10th spot on this list. Flying into the 9th spot is Nyctopteryx, a hybrid that continues to prove just how valuable utility and synergy can be in the current environment. Arguably, this creature possesses the single best turn 1 option in the entire game. The combination of daze, cleanse, and automatic swapping through blinding impact gives Nyctopteryx absurd control while simultaneously allowing it to safely reposition into more favorable matchups. All these effects quickly turn the pterosaur into a nightmare to properly put down. That said, the hybrid does come with one notable weakness, in that it can be somewhat draw reliant depending on what creature it swaps into. A poorly timed swap can absolutely cost momentum if the follow-up matchup isn't favorable. Even so, when it comes to enabling teammates and constantly generating value throughout a match, very few synergists currently do the job better than Nyctopteryx. This pterosaur will perch as our 9th valued creature on this roster. We have now reached the halfway point of the top 16, and flocking at number 8 is Aquignathus, currently the strongest flock hybrid in the game. While the creature may not appear overwhelming at first glance, anyone who has actively fought or used it understands very quickly just how difficult it is to properly deal with. A huge part of that comes from its ability to constantly generate pressure while maintaining incredible survivability through repeated swapping and strong team synergy. Furthermore, Having access to a devastating turn 2 setup gives Aquignathus offensive output that many other flocks simply cannot replicate. Combined with an excellent swap-in ability and the capacity to repeatedly cycle itself back into battle, the hybrid becomes extremely difficult to wear down over the course of a match, being one of the few counters to both Beckle hybrids currently present. For lack of a better term, it may just do flock things, but when those flock things are backed by this much pressure and utility, you end up with one of the most frustrating creatures currently roaming the arena, solidly cementing Aquignathus at number 8. Taking the 7th spot is Atrocomaxima, currently one of the most dangerous revenge killers in the game and arguably one of the most slept on threats in the entire roster. While many still reduce it to a simple revenge killer, in practice, the hybrid has evolved far beyond that single identity. What makes Atrocomaxima so dangerous is the sheer amount of pressure it creates once it enters the battlefield. Opponents are often forced into terrible situations where they either stay in and directly fight it, or cut their losses entirely and attempt to revenge kill it before things spiral out of control. A massive reason for this comes from the absurd utility found within Feverish Counter. The recent improvements to its Daze effect dramatically increased the hybrid's flexibility to the point where Atrocomaxima can now legitimately get away with functioning as a swapper in certain situations. Combined with its enormous health pool and fantastic resistances, and the hybrid becomes incredibly difficult to effectively put down. Quite frankly, this hybrid just gets away with far more than it reasonably should. And if anything, this placement may still be underselling just how dangerous Atrocomaxima has become. Breaking into the top 6 is Proto Lux, a hybrid that recently received buffs, pushing it from a strong defensive creature into an impenetrable shield wall. The combination of group defensive rampage alongside its blessing abilities makes the creature incredibly difficult to topple, to the point where traditional blight strategies often struggle to make meaningful progress as the two effects repeatedly cancel each other out. What truly elevated Proto Lux, however, is how much more comfortable it now feels entering direct head-to-head engagements. Matchups that were previously problematic, such as Becklejara, Becklerizsaurus, and even Baryotor, have become significantly more manageable thanks to its ability to repeatedly heal itself back to full. Furthermore, the hybrid has become extremely difficult to revenge kill. Opponents are often forced into situations where they either need to carefully play around group defensive rampage, or simply wait for cheat death to wear off while Proto Lux continuously generates value. And unless a creature has reliable nullification or ways to consistently bypass its defensive utility, breaking through this thing becomes a Herculean task. That said, the creature isn't without weaknesses. Daze still remains one of the best ways to slow its momentum, alongside well-timed swaps from creatures such as Becklerizz or heavily bulky threats like Masto. With that said, after the recent buffs, Proto Lux has firmly established itself as one of the most oppressive head-to-head hybrids currently dominating the arena. For this reason, this creature will back itself up into number 6. Piercing its way into the final 5 is Kentrorex, a hybrid that continues to prove that simplicity and practicality are some of the best policies in Jurassic World alive. Built on top of the best legendary in the entire game, there is plenty of efficiency off-rip. Despite operating with what is essentially a very 2023 playstyle, Kentrorex remains one of the most oppressive setup creatures in the game once it gains momentum. A massive reason for this comes from how effectively the hybrid abuses speed investment. In many ways, the current speed wars within the meta only made Kentrorex even more dangerous, allowing it to set up situations that quickly spiral out of control for the opponent. The combo of Vitalize into critical evasive strike followed by decimating Thagomizer create an incredibly threatening setup loop that many creatures simply cannot take on directly. And because Thagomizer remains unblockable, successfully reaching that setup often forces opponents into extremely unfavorable situations. With this in mind, its placement is slightly held back by accessibility. Much like Megatyrannus, Kentrorex is currently extremely difficult to properly create and optimize, while also suffering from a fairly mediocre set of resistances. Stegosaurian dinosaurs and hybrids have historically dominated metas for a very good reason. Their straightforward playstyles consistently remain among the most effective strategies in the game, and Kentrorex may very well be one of the strongest modern examples of that philosophy to date. This hybrid will snag the first spot in our top 5. Charging into our 4th spot is another newcomer, Centrolophus Lux, a placement that will likely turn a few heads, but after extensive testing, we genuinely believe this hybrid is one of the strongest creatures currently operating in the arena. A massive reason for that comes down to one thing: Daze. The recent buff extending its Daze effect to 3 turns drastically improved the hybrid's overall control potential, giving Centrolophus Lux significantly more room to maneuver around dangerous matchups while continuously suppressing enemy pressure. In a meta heavily reliant on counterattacks and on escape effects, The prolonged daze becomes incredibly valuable. Offensively, this hybrid remains just as threatening. Opening with Cunning Dodge Impact before transitioning into Cunning Resilient Rampage still allows Centrolux to eliminate major threats such as Becklejara. Furthermore, the recent improvements to its counterattack have made its speed control far more oppressive, allowing the hybrid to maintain the speed advantage across a huge number of engagements. And losing speed against the Ceratopsian often leaves opponents vulnerable to devastating retaliation. Funnily enough, Centrolux may very well be one of the most dangerous swap predictors currently in the game. A single incorrect prediction against this creature can immediately swing the pace of a match beyond recovery. After the recent buffs, Centrolophus Lux has firmly established itself among the upper echelon of the current meta, charging its way directly into our 4th placement. This list has a lot of newcomers, and one of those hybrids holding joint 3rd place is Baryotor, a creature that has rapidly evolved into one of the most terrifying forces currently dominating the arena. And truthfully, what makes this thing so dangerous isn't just the raw power output, although that alone is already enough. It's the sheer flexibility the creature possesses across nearly every possible role. Baryotor can comfortably function as an opener, revenge killer, or late game closer, and somehow it excels in all 3 roles with minimal compromise. Even at lower investment, the hybrid remains extremely effective. At level 32 with tier 5 access, it can already perform at an absurdly high level. The removal of Titanotholus from its natural counterplay only amplified this issue further, allowing Baryotor to operate with far fewer safe answers in the current environment. In fact, Blessed Shield Strike gives Baryotor far more staying power than many players initially expect by boosting its overall healing output. We mention this because one of the most surprising interactions involves Aquignathus, a creature that should theoretically counter Baryotor extremely well. However, once Blessed Shield Strike is active, the increased healing applied to Baryotor's devouring counter allows it to muscle through the exchange while gradually chipping the flock down over time. That said, the hybrid is unfortunately not invincible. Daze remains one of the strongest tools for suppressing its pressure, particularly against all revealing setups, while well-timed on-escape abuse can occasionally force unfavorable trades. The problem, however, is even when Baryotor is properly punished, there is still a very real chance you lose over half your health in the process. Finally, it's worth noting that Baryotor currently stands as the scariest closer in the game behind Becklerizsaurus, further reinforcing its threat level. With a cascade of offensive pressure, role versatility, and extremely limited safe answers, the eyeless horror firmly cements itself as the 3rd deadliest hybrid currently terrorizing Jurassic World alive. Falling from its previous spot at number 1 is Becklejara, a hybrid that, despite no longer holding the crown, remains one of the single most oppressive creatures in the game's history. The rise of creatures such as Proto Lux, Baryotor, and even the occasional Mastodonsaurus has made Becklejara far less comfortable as a universal lead than it once was. While it still remains one of the strongest openers in the entire game, there are now significantly more creatures capable of contesting its momentum immediately. That shift matters because Becklejara thrives off maintaining the lead. Once it secures a kill, the hybrid wants to continue snowballing pressure onto the next target. However, the current meta has become slightly better at interrupting that cycle, forcing Becklejara into more awkward trades than before. And while RNG can occasionally influence certain exchanges, Becklejara's absurd overall toolkit usually allows it to brute force its way through situations that would stop most hybrids entirely. The king of hybrid beasts parks itself comfortably in 2nd place. Taking the crown as the deadliest creature currently dominating Jurassic World alive is none other than Becklerizsaurus, a hybrid that has steadily climbed this list month after month, rising from number 4 to number 2, and now finally claiming that top spot. As the saying goes, one man's trash is another man's treasure, and while a portion of the community didn't take too kindly to the Titanotholus nerf, Becklerizsaurus absolutely did. The change ended up being one of the biggest factors pushing this creature completely over the edge. Being one of the very few reliable punishing options capable of safely swapping into Becklerizsaurus was heavily weakened, and once that obstacle disappeared, the hybrid's overall dominance became significantly harder to contain. The creature benefits from almost every single situation imaginable. There is virtually no interaction where Becklerizsaurus walks away without gaining something in return. Wild triple strike still remains absurd. A deadly multi-hit attack with the looming threat to land critical hits in between creates a level of pressure that becomes incredibly difficult to consistently mitigate. And what truly pushes Becklerizz into completely unreasonable territory is the sheer amount of control it possesses over a match. Anger on escape makes attempting to swap against this thing borderline suicidal, Even when opponents successfully pivot into nullifying creatures, the amount of damage Becklerizsaurus generates during the exchange often leaves players wondering whether the swap was even worth attempting in the first place. And somehow, that still isn't the end of it. Immunity to swap prevention and speed decrease means any traditional control options simply fail outright. Even as a lead, Becklerizsaurus remains incredibly difficult to safely challenge, capable of immediately forcing pressure onto opponents while still maintaining absurd late game closing potential afterward. Quite frankly, this creature simply does everything you could possibly want from a hybrid at an elite level. At times, fighting this thing genuinely feels less like a matchup and more like your opponent pressed an instant win button. And after months of steadily climbing the ranks, the younger brother finally claims the throne as the deadliest creature currently dominating Jurassic World alive. Ladies and gentlemen, these were the top 16 deadliest creatures currently roaming this game's ecosystem. A list containing some of the most grim ways you could possibly meet your end in the arena. Of course, there are still plenty of other threats lurking out just outside the rankings, especially once Tier 5 enhancements begin warping the battlefield beyond recognition. And of course, our honorable mentions. In the end, only the strongest may come out on top. Class is now dismissed.